Holy Bible reading to request divine union, Theosis, part 110. We continue with 2 Maccabees of the Old Testament, and we'll be reading New Testament after that. And I remind you that we do this because the early church fathers and latter church fathers described to us how we can use this exercise, and the grace of God will come to us in the form of the Holy Spirit to sit in our hearts. This is called divine union or theosis, reading twice as many chapters of the Old Testament as we do in the New Testament. Usually they suggest 2 chapters of the Old Testament, 1 chapter of the New, and you would be finished reading the Bible in a year. I think that we've already gone through half the Old Testament and most of the New Testament, but it looks like it's going to be less than a year for us, but we'll see. God will give us strength and will guide us. And now we're on 2 Maccabees, and we continue on chapter 9. God punishes Antiochus. About that time it happened that Antiochus returned in dishonor from the region of Persia, for he had entered the city called Persepolis and attempted to rob the temples and control the city. Therefore, when the citizens rushed to the city's aid with arms, Antiochus and his men were routed, and it came about that Antiochus was put to flight by the citizens and made a shameful return home. Now while he was in Ecbatana, news came to him about what had happened to Nicanor and the forces of Timothy. Swollen with rage, he supposed that he would also vent upon the Jews and the evil done to him by those who had banished him. Wherefore he commanded his charioteer to drive without stopping to complete the journey. But the judgment of heaven came upon him, for in his arrogance he said, "When I arrive there, I will make Jerusalem a common burial place for the Jews." But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him with an incurable and unseen plague. For as soon as he stopped speaking, the deadly pain seized him in his inward parts, with sharp internal torments, and this very justly, for he had tortured the inward parts of others with many and unusual afflictions. Yet by no means did he cease from his haughtiness, but was evermore filled with arrogance, breathing fire in his rage against the Jews and giving orders to hasten the journey. So it came to pass that he fell out of his chariot as it rushed along, and the fall was so hard that it tortured every limb of his body. He who had just been thinking that he could command the waves of the sea because of his superhuman arrogance, and imagined he could weigh the high mountains in a balance, was brought down to earth and carried in a litter. Thus he conveyed plainly to all the manifest power of God. Accordingly, worms swarmed up from the ungodly man's body, and his flesh rotted away while he was still alive. Anguished and in pain because of his odor, the whole army was repulsed by his rottenness, and because of his intolerable smell, no one was able to carry the man who a little while before thought he could touch the stars of heaven. Then he was broken down and began to cease from much of his arrogance and to come to a recognition of the divine scourge, for he was bent over with pain at every moment. Then when he could no longer endure his own stench, he spoke these words: "It is right to be subject to God, and no mortal should think that he is equal with God." Then this disgusting man prayed to the Lord, who would no longer have mercy on him, saying that the holy city, which he had been hastening to level to the ground and make into a common burial place, he was now proclaiming to be free. Moreover, the Jews, who he did not consider worthy of a burial place, but to be thrown out along with their children for the wild animals and the birds to eat, he would make them all equal to citizens of Athens. Furthermore, the holy temple, which he had plundered in times past, he would adorn with the finest offerings and restore many times over. All the holy vessels and the taxes assigned to the sacrifices he would pay from his own revenues. In addition to this, he would also become a Jew and visit every inhabited place to proclaim the might of God. A final letter to the Jews. But when his sufferings did not cease at all, for the judgment of God came upon him justly, he was driven to despair over what had happened to him. Thus he wrote the Jews a letter recorded below, in the form of a supplication, It contained the following words: To the good Jewish citizens, Antiochus, your king and general, sends many greetings and good wishes for your health and welfare. If you and your children are strong and your interests are served, then I am glad. With my hope in heaven, I kindly remember your respect and goodwill. Now, as I was returning home from the region of Persia, I was struck with a difficult illness, and now consider it necessary to be concerned about the common safety of all. But I am not giving up hope for myself, for I have great hope of escaping from this illness. Nevertheless, I observed that even my father, when he led his army into the upper countries, appointed his successor, that if anything unexpected should arise or any unwelcome news should come, the people throughout the realm would not be troubled, for they would know to whom the government was left. In addition to this, I understand how the rulers close at hand and the neighbors of my kingdom keep watch for opportunities and wait to see how things will turn out. Thus I have appointed my son Antiochus to be king. And oftentimes when I hastened off to the upper provinces, I entrusted and commended him to most of you. So I have written to him what is written here. Therefore I urge you and request that you remember my acts of kindness for both the common and private good, and maintain your present goodwill towards me and my son, for I am persuaded that he, following my policy, will treat you kindly and considerately. So the murderer and a blasphemer suffered very grievously, as he had treated others, for he died a miserable death in the mountain of a foreign land. Then Philip, who grew up with him, took his body home, but fearing the son of Antiochus, he went instead to Ptolemy Philometor in Egypt. Chapter 10. Judas Maccabeus purifies the temple. With the Lord leading them on, Maccabeus and those with him received back the temple and the city. They took down the altars fabricated in the marketplace by the foreigners, and also destroyed the sacred precincts. When they had purified the temple, they made another altar, and striking fire out of stones, they offered sacrifices, the first in 2 years. They offered incense and lit lamps and set out the bread of the presence. When they had done this, they fell prostrate and besought the Lord, so as never again to fall into such calamities. But if they should ever sin, they might be chastened by him with gentleness and not be handed over to blasphemous and barbarous nations. It happened on the anniversary of the same day the temple was profaned by the foreigners, that the purification of the temple took place. On the 25th day of the same month, which was Chislev. This is the celebration of Hanukkah. That's why the Hebrews celebrate Hanukkah. It's because of the retaking of the temple. Going back to the text, they celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the Feast of Tabernacles, remembering how a short time before they had spent the feast living in mountains and caves like wild animals. Therefore, carrying ivy wreaths, wands, beautiful olive branches, and even palm branches, they offered hymns of praise to him who had made possible the purifying of his own place. They decreed by a common edict and vote that the whole Jewish nation should celebrate these days every year. Such then was the end of Antiochus, called Epiphanes. The reign of Antiochus V begins. Now we will tell you what took place under Antiochus Epiphanes, the son of that ungodly man, and will set forth and encompass briefly the calamities of the wars. For this man inherited the kingdom and appointed a certain Lysias, a chief governor of Coele and Phoenicia. Then Ptolemy, called Macron, led the way in protecting the rights of the Jews because of the wrongdoing that happened to them, and he attempted to maintain peaceful relations with them. For this reason he was accused before Epiphanes by the king's friends. He heard himself called a traitor at every turn because he abandoned Cyprus, entrusted to him by Philometor, and defected to Antiochus Epiphanes. Since he could not exercise his noble authority honorably, he took poison and ended his life. The Edomians fall to Judas. When Gorgias became governor of the region, he maintained mercenary troops and attacked the Jews at every turn. At the same time, the Edomians in possession of vital strongholds, were harassing the Jews. They received fugitives from Jerusalem and endeavored to keep up the war. But Maccabeus and his men made supplications and implored God to be their ally, then rushed against the strongholds of the Idumeans. They attacked them aggressively, gained possession of the places, and drove back all who fought upon the wall. They slaughtered everyone they encountered, killing no fewer than 20,000. But at least 9,000 fell into two very strong towers, which were well equipped, containing everything necessary to withstand a siege. So Maccabeus left behind Simon, Joseph, and also Zacchaeus, and those with him, a force sufficient to besiege them. Then he went to more urgent places. But those around Simon, who were money lovers, were bribed by some of those in the towers. When they had received 70,000 drachmas, they allowed some of them to slip away. When news of what happened reached Maccabeus, he gathered the leaders of the people and accused them of selling their brothers for money by releasing their enemies to fight against them. Then he killed these men who had become traitors and immediately seized the two towers. Faring well at arms in everything he undertook, he destroyed more than 20,000 in the two fortresses. Maccabeus victorious over Timothy. Now Timothy, who had been defeated previously by the Jews, gathered a very massive and powerful force of mercenaries and assembled cavalry from Asia in no small number. Then he arrived as though he would take Judea captive. As he drew near, Maccabeus and his men made supplication to God. As they sprinkled earth on their hands and girded their loins with sackcloth, they fell prostrate before the foot of the altar and implored him to be merciful to them, and to be an enemy to their enemies and an adversary to their adversaries, as the law plainly shows. Then arising from prayer, they took up their weapons and advanced a considerable distance from the city. When they came near the enemy, they were by themselves. But as dawn was breaking, the armies attacked one another. The one had the guarantee of prosperity and victory with their virtue and the Lord as their place of refuge, but the other depended on rage as their leader in the fight. When the battle was strongly contested, they appeared to the enemy from heaven 5 majestic men on horses with golden bridles, and they were leading the Jews. They took Maccabeus between them and shielded him with their own armor. They kept him from being wounded and cast arrows and thunderbolts on the enemy. Wherefore, confused with blindness and full of disorder, they were cut to pieces. 20,500 were slaughtered, along with 600 cavalry. Timothy himself fell to a stronghold called Gazara, especially well garrisoned, where Chareas was commander. Maccabeus and his men eagerly besieged the stronghold for 4 days, but the men within it trusted in the security of the place. So they kept blaspheming beyond measure and uttering disgusting words. Now when the 5th day dawned, 20 young men in the army of Maccabeus burned with anger because of the blasphemies. So they bravely attacked the wall, and with savage fury struck down everyone they encountered. Others likewise went up during the distraction against those inside and burned down the towers. They kindled fires and burned the blasphemers alive. Others broke through the gates, let in the rest of the force, and took control of the city. They killed Timothy, who was hiding in a well, and his brother Chareas and Apollophanes. When they had done this, they blessed the Lord with hymns and praises, thanking him who showed great kindness to Israel and gives them victory. Chapter 11. The defeat of Lysias. Shortly afterwards, Lysias, who was the king's guardian and kingsman in charge of the government, was greatly upset at what had happened, and gathered about 80,000 infantry and all his cavalry to come against the Jews. He proposed to make the city a home for Greeks, to levy taxes on the temple as he did on the sacred places of other nations, and to put the high priesthood up for sale every year. He took no account at all of God's power, but was elated with his countless thousands of infantry and thousands of cavalry, plus his 80 elephants. Thus the cavalry plus his 80 elephants. Thus he entered Judea and drew near Beth Zur, a fortified place about 20 miles from Jerusalem, and besieged it. When Maccabeus and his men heard of this, that Lysias was besieging the strongholds, they and all the people begged the Lord with lamentations and tears and send a good angel to save Israel. Maccabeus himself was the first to bear arms, and he pleaded with the others to join with him in risking their lives to go help their brothers. Then they eagerly set out together, but in that place while they were still near Jerusalem, a horseman appeared before them, clothed in white and brandishing a full armor of gold. Then together they all blessed the merciful God and were strengthened in heart, ready to bring damage not only on humans but on the most savage of beasts or walls of iron. Because the Lord had mercy on them, they advanced with their weapons, having with them their ally from heaven. They hurled themselves against the enemy like lions and overthrew 11,000 of them, as well as 1,600 cavalry, and forced all of them to flee. Most of them escaped, wounded and naked, and Lysias himself escaped by a disgraceful flight. A peace accord with the Jews. But as Lysias was not lacking in intelligence, he discussed the loss that had happened to him. He realized that the Hebrews were unconquerable because the Almighty God was their ally. So he sent a message and persuaded them to settle everything on just terms. Moreover, perhaps he could also persuade the king and compel him to become their friend. Then Maccabeus agreed to everything Lysias urged, since he was concerned about what was best for all. For whatever Maccabeus gave to Lysias in writing concerning the Jews, the king granted. 4 letters were written to the Jews from Lysias encompassing the following. Lysias to the people of the Jews, greetings. John and Absalom, who were sent by you, have given us your signed communication and asked about the matters addressed in it. Accordingly, I reported to the king whatever was necessary to bring him, and he granted whatever was possible. If you will keep your goodwill towards the government, I will try in future to promote your welfare. So on behalf of these things and their details, I have ordered that these men and my representatives confer with you. Farewell, the 148th year, the 24th of Dios Corinthius. Now the king's letters contained the following. King Antiochus to Lysias' brother, greetings. Since our father has departed to the gods, we desire the subjects of the kingdom be undisturbed in caring for their own affairs. We understand the Jews do not approve of our fathers' change to Greek customs, but choose their own way of life and ask that their customs be granted them. Since therefore we prefer for this nation to be free from disturbance, our decision is for their temple to be returned to them, and for them to live according to the customs of their forefathers. Therefore you will do well to send them word to them and give them assurances of friendship, so they may know our policy. Be in good spirits and continue gladly to help them in their own affairs. The king's letter to the nation was as follows. King Antiochus to the Jewish Senate and the rest of the Jews, greetings. If you are healthy, this would be as we desire. We are also in good health. Menelaus has told us you wish to return home and attend to your own affairs. Therefore, those who return home by the 13th of Xanthicus will have our pledge of friendship with freedom from fear. For the Jews to enjoy their own food and laws as before, and none of them shall be troubled in any way for things done in ignorance. I have also sent Menelaus to encourage you. Farewell, the 148th year, the 15th of Xanthicus. The Romans also sent them a letter, which read as follows. Quintus Memmius and Titus Manius, legates of the Romans, to the people of the Jews, greetings. We also approve of these things concerning which Lysias, the kinsman of the king, has granted you. But the matters he decided to report to the king, as soon as you have considered these things, send someone promptly that we may explain what is suitable for you, for we are on our way to Antioch. For this reason, make haste and send someone to let us know your intentions. Farewell, the 148th year, the 15th of Xanthicus. Chapter 12. Judas prevails in Joppa and Jamnia. When these agreements had been made, Lysias returned to the king, and the Jews went back to their farming. But some of the governors of various locales, Timothy and Apollonius, son of Geneus, as well as Hieronymus and Demophon, and in addition Nicanor, the commander of the Cyprians, would not allow the Jews to enjoy tranquility and live in peace. When the people of Joppa did so great and ungodly deed as this, they invited the Jews who live among them, together with their wives and children, to embark on ships equipped for sea, as though they harbored no ill towards them. Now this was done by the common vote of the city. But when the Jews welcomed this, wishing to live in peace and suspected nothing, the men of Joppa took them out to sea and drowned at least 200 of them. When Judas learned of the cruelty visited on his countrymen, he summoned his men. So when he had called upon God, the righteous judge, he attacked the murderers of his brothers. He set the harbor on fire by night, burned the ships, and put to the sword those who fled there. But since the gates of the city were closed, he departed, intending to come again and root out the whole community of Joppa. However, when he learned that the people in Jamnia intended to wipe out the Jews who were living among them in the same way, he attacked the Jamnian people by night and set the harbor and the fleet on fire. Therefore, the glow of the light was visible as far as Jerusalem, 30 miles away. Defeat of the nomads. When they had gone about a mile from there on their march against Timothy, Arabs attacked him with no less than 5,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. After a strongly contested battle, Judas and his men, with God's help, were successful. The defeated nomads pleaded with Judas to grant them pledges of friendship. They promised to give him livestock and to benefit them in other ways. So Judas supposed they could indeed be useful in varied ways, agreed to make peace with them. Then, after he accepted their pledges, they returned to their tents. He also attacked a certain town named Caspine, strongly fortified with earthworks and walls, and inhabited by a mixed population of Gentiles. Those within it trusted in the security of the walls and their supply of provisions. They behaved very contemptuously towards Judas and his men, insulting them and even blaspheming and saying unlawful things. But Judas and his men called upon the great Lord of the world, who overthrew Jericho without battering rams or engines of war in the times of Joshua. Then Judas and his men assaulted the walls. They overpowered the city by the will of God and inflicted such indescribable slaughter that the adjoining lake, a quarter of a mile wide, seemed to be filled with blood. Victory over Timothy's garrison. From there they went 95 miles and continued on to Charax, to the Jews who were called Tubiani. They did not overtake Timothy in that region, for by then they had departed from there without accomplishing anything. But in one place Timothy left a very strong garrison. Dositheus and Sosipater, who were commanders under Maccabees, marched out and crushed those men Timothy left in the stronghold, over 10,000 soldiers. But Maccabees organized his army in divisions, setting men in command of the divisions, and hastened after Timothy, who had with him 120,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry. When Timothy learned of the approach of Judas, he sent the women and the children ahead with the baggage to a place called Karnaim, for that place was hard to attack and difficult to access because of the narrowness of all its places. But when Judas' first division appeared, alarm and fear came over the enemy at the manifestation of him who sees all things. They ran off in flight, rushing headlong in every direction, so as to be often hurt by their own men and stabbed by the points of their own swords. Judas persuaded them with great vigor, piercing the sinful men with a sword and killing as many as 30,000 of them. Judas pursued them, with the great vigor. Timothy himself fell into the hands of Dositheus and Sosipater with their soldiers. With great trickery, he pleaded with them to let him go safely, because he held the parents of most of them and some of their brothers, to whom no regard would be shown. So when with many words he had confirmed his solemn promise to restore them unharmed, they released him for the sake of rescuing their brothers. Other campaigns. When Judas marched against Karnaim and the temple of Atargatis and destroyed 25,000 people, after the rout and slaughter of these, he also marched on Ephron, a fortified town where Lysias lived with countless people of all nations. Strong young men were set as guards before the walls and fought mightily. Many provisions of war engines and missiles were stored there. But the Jews called upon the Lord, who with power crushes the strength of his enemies. Thus they took possession of the city and killed as many as 25,000 of those within it. Moving away from Ephron, they hurried on to Scythopolis, 75 miles from Jerusalem. But when the Jews who lived there testified to the goodwill of the people of Scythopolis had shown them and their civilized treatment of them in times of trouble, they thanked them and encouraged them also to be favorable to the Jewish race in the future. Then Judas and his men arrived at Jerusalem, the Feast of Weeks being close at hand. After this feast, also called Pentecost, they marched against Gorgias, the governor of Idumea. He came out against them with 3,000 infantry and 400 cavalry. After they engaged in battle, it happened that a few of the Jews were killed, but a certain Dositheus, one of Besenor's men, a man on horseback and a strong man, grabbed hold of Gorgias. He took hold of his cloak and was dragging him off by sheer strength. He intended to take the accursed man alive, but one of the Thracian cavalry chased him down and severed his arm, so Gorgias fled to Marianas. Now Esdras and his men had been fighting for a long while and were tired, so Judas called on the Lord to show himself as their ally and leader in battle. They began to sound the battle cry in the language of their forefathers, and sang hymns. Then he charged against the troops of Gorgias when they least expected it and set them to flight. Prayers for the fallen. So these are commemorative services for the deceased, by the way. Prayers for the fallen. Then Judas retrieved his army and entered the city of Adullam. As the seventh day was dawning, they purified themselves according to custom and spent the Sabbath there. The following day, as was now necessary, Judas and his men left to gather up the bodies of those killed in battle, to bring them back to rest with their kindred in the tombs of their forefathers. But under the tunics of each of the dead, they uncovered sacred tokens of the Jamnian idols, which the Jews are forbidden by law to wear. So the reason these men died in battle became clear to everyone. Thus they all blessed the ways of the Lord, the righteous judge, who reveals the hidden things. They turned to supplication and prayed that the sin they had committed might be completely blotted out. The noble Judas exhorted his people to guard themselves from sin, for with their own eyes they had seen what happened to those who died in battle because of their sin. He then took up an offering from his soldiers amounting to 2,000 silver drachmas and sent it to Jerusalem to present as a sin offering. In doing so he acted properly and with honor, taking note of the resurrection. For if he were not looking for the resurrection of those fallen, it would have been utterly foolish to pray for the departed. But since he was looking to the reward of splendor laid up for those who repose in godliness, it was a holy and godly purpose. Thus he made atonement for the fallen, so as to set them free from their transgression. Chapter 13. The death of Menelaus. In the 149th year, Judith and his men got word that Antiochus Eppator was marching against Judea with a huge army, and with him his guardian Lysias, who was in charge of the government. Each of them had a Greek army of 110,000 infantry, 5,300 horsemen, 22 elephants, and 300 chariots armed with scythes. Menelaus also joined forces with them. It was a great irony that he encouraged Antiochus, not for the preservation of his homeland, but for his expectation to be established in authority. But the King of Kings aroused anger in Antiochus against this sinful man. So when Lysias pointed out that this man was the cause of all the trouble, he commanded them to take him to Verea, to put him to death, as was the custom there. For there is a tower in that place, 50 cubits high and filled with ashes. It also has a contrivance continuing around it on all sides that incline steeply into the ashes. There they will shove anyone guilty of sacrilege or who has done excessive evils to their destruction. Thus it happened with Menelaus, the lawbreaker, died by such a destiny. He was even deprived of burial in the ground. Now this was altogether just, for since he committed many sins against the sacred altar, whose fire and ashes were holy, he should get death for himself in ashes. The Jews prevail near Modin. The king was coming with barbarous arrogance to face the Jews with things far worse than anything done by his father. But when Judas learned of this, he charged the people to call upon the Lord day and night, asking him to help them now as he had formerly, for they were about to be deprived of their law, their homeland, and their temple. They prayed that he would not allow the people who had just begun a new life to fall into the hands of the blaspheming Gentiles. After they all made the same petition together and constantly implored the merciful Lord with weeping, fasting, and prostrations for 3 days, Judas encouraged them and commanded them to stand firm. Then he consulted privately with the elders and determined to march out to let the matter be decided by the help of God before the king's army could enter Judea and take possession of the city. So committing their results to the Creator of all and urging those with him to fight nobly to the death of the laws, the temple, the city, the country, and the commonwealth, he positioned his army near Modin, after he gave his men the watchword, God's victory, and chose his best young men. He besieged the royal palace by night, killing as many as 2,000 men in the camp. He also slew the leading elephant with its ruler. As a result, they filled the camp with terror and disorder and departed victoriously. All this happened by daybreak because the protection of the Lord was with them. Antiochus V makes peace with the Jews. Thus the king tasted the courage of the Jews and plotted a strategy against their position. He marched against Beth Zur, a stronghold of the Jews, but was turned back. He attacked again, but was beaten. Judas then sent supplies to the men inside the fortress, but Rhodicus, a man from the Jewish army, tipped off the enemy with secret information. Thus he was sought after, caught, and imprisoned. The king spoke a second time with the people in Beth Zur, gave assurances, received their pledge, and departed. He then attacked Judas and his forces, but was vanquished. He then learned that Philip, whom he had left in charge of the government in Antioch, had lost his sanity. He was disheartened and summoned the Jews and yielded and gave an oath to honor all their rights. Thus he settled with them and offered sacrifice, respected the temple, and treated the place humanely. He welcomed Maccabees, and Hegemonides was left as governor from Ptolemais to Gerar. Then he went to Ptolemais, but the people of Ptolemais were indignant over the treaty with the Jews. In fact, they were so enraged they sought to annul its provisions. But Lysias took the public stage and defended the treaty as best he could. He did persuade them and gained their goodwill. He returned to Antioch, and this is the outcome of the king's strategy and settlement. Chapter 14. Alcimus accuses Judas. After 3 years' time, word reached Judas and his soldiers that Demetrius, the son of Seleucus, had killed Antiochus, and Lysias, his guardian, then had sailed into the harbor of Tripolis with a powerful army and fleet and taken possession of the country. Now there was a certain Alcimus, formerly a high priest, who had willfully defiled himself in the times of social and political disturbance. He realized there was no way for him to live in safety or to approach the holy altar ever again. So he went to King Demetrius sometime in the 151st year and presented him a crown of gold and a palm branch, as well as some of the customary olive branches from the temple. During that day he remained peaceful, but he seized an opportunity in his own stupidity when he was invited by Demetrius to a session of the council and was questioned about the disposition and intentions of the Jews. Thus he said to the council, "Those of the Jews who are called Hasidians, whose leaders is Judas Maccabees, are maintaining war and stirring up rebellion and will not allow the kingdom to attain stability. Wherefore I have set aside my paternal glory, meaning my high priesthood, and now have come here. I came here first out of my honest concern for the well-being of the king, and second out of consideration for my own fellow citizens, for through the rashness of those just mentioned, our entire nation is suffering misfortune. Because you, O king, are acquainted with the details of these things, please take care of our country and our hard-pressed people with the gracious love for mankind that you have for everyone. For as long as Judas is alive, it will be impossible for the government to experience peace." Nicanor sent to kill Judas. After he had said this, the rest of the king's friends who bore malice against Judas aroused even greater anger in Demetrius. Immediately he chose Nicanor, the commander of the squadron of elephants, appointed him governor of Judea. He sent him off with a charge to kill Judas, scatter his soldiers, and assemble alchemists as high priest of the great temple. The Gentiles who had fled before Judas throughout Judea joined Nicanor, for they thought the setbacks and calamities of the Jews would bring prosperity to themselves. The Jews got word of Nicanor's coming and the assault of the Gentiles, so they sprinkled their heads with earth and prayed to him who establishes his people forever and always helps his own inheritance by making himself present. At the command of Judas, their leader, they immediately moved the army from there and met the enemy in battle at a village called Dessau. Simon, the brother of Judas, had encountered Nicanor in battle, but was halted because of the unexpected silence of those adversaries. A short-lived alliance. Nevertheless, when Nicanor heard the bravery of Judas and his men and their courage in battle for their country, he pulled back from deciding the matter by bloodshed. So he sent forth Posidonius, Theodotus, and Mattathias to offer and receive pledges of friendship. After an extensive investigation of the terms, the leader communicated the terms to the people, and it appeared that they were of one mind, and they agreed to the treaty. So they set aside a day to meet privately. From each army a chariot came forward, the seats of honor were set in place. Judas appointed battle-ready men at strategic places, lest the enemy attempt sudden trickery, and the consultation was held in a fitting way. Nicanor remained in Jerusalem and did nothing improper, but he dismissed the crowd of people that had gathered. He also kept Judas in his presence continually, for he was heartily attached to the man. He encouraged him to marry and have children. Thus Judas got married, settled down, and lived a normal life. A rekindled enmity. When Alcimus became aware of their goodwill for each other, he took the treaty that was made and went to King Demetrius. He told him Nicanor was disloyal to the government, since he had appointed Judas, the plotter against the kingdom, to be his successor. The king became enraged. Provoked by the false accusation of the depraved man, he wrote to Nicanor that he was most displeased with the treaty and ordered him to send Maccabeus as a prisoner to Antioch at once. When this message reached Nicanor, he was upset and very grieved that he had to break the agreement when the man had not done wrong. But since he could not act in opposition to the king, he watched for a strategic opportunity to carry out the command. Maccabeus noticed that Nicanor was becoming more harsh in his treatment of him and more rude than when they met than was customary. Judas decided Nicanor's sour behavior was not at all propitious, so he gathered up a good number of his men and hid from him. When Nicanor realized he had been boldly outmaneuvered by the man, he went to the great and holy temple and found the priests offering the customary sacrifices. He commanded them to hand him over. They declared under oath that they did not know the whereabouts of the man he sought. So Nicanor stretched out his right hand towards the temple and swore this oath: "If you will not hand over Judas to me as a prisoner, I will raze this shrine of God to the ground, destroy the altar, and erect at this place a splendid temple to Dionysius." After he said this, he departed. Then the priests stretched out their hands to heaven, calling up to the everlasting defender of our nation, saying, "O Lord of all, while you have need of nothing, you were pleased to have a temple for your dwelling in our midst. Now then, O Holy One, O Lord of all holiness, preserve forever undefiled this house so recently purified." Razis the elder dies. Razis was one of the elders of Jerusalem and was denounced before Nicanor as a man who loved his fellow citizens, a man held in high esteem and called the father of the Jews because of his goodwill. For in past times, when there was isolation from the Gentiles, he was brought to judgment for practicing the Jewish religion, though with all zeal he risked his life, body, and soul for his religion. Nicanor wished to make obvious his ill will for the Jews, so he sent more than 500 soldiers to arrest Razis, for he thought that by arresting him he would produce calamity among the Jews. Thus when the soldiers were about to capture the tower and were forcing open the door of the courtyard. They commanded that the doors be set on fire. When Razis was surrounded, he fell upon his own sword, for he preferred to die bravely rather than fall into the hands of sinners and suffer outrageous, unworthy of his own noble birth. However, in the tension of the confrontation, he did not fall with exactness on his sword. As the crowd rushed through the doors, he took courage and jumped up on the wall, bravely throwing himself down into the throng. But as people quickly stepped back, there was an open space, and he landed in the midst of the empty area. He was still alive. In a blaze of anger, he stood up, and though his blood gushed like a spring, and his injuries were severe, he darted through the crowd. He climbed up on a steep rock, and with his blood completely drained out of him, he tore out his intestines, took them in both hands, and threw them at the crowd as he called on the Lord of life and spirit to return them to him again. Such was the manner of his death. Chapter 15, Nicanor's failed plan. When Nicanor learned that Judas and his men were in the province of Samaria, he decided to attack them in utter safety in their day of rest. But the Jews who were forced to accompany him said, "By no means should you so cruelly and barbarously bring destruction. Show respect for the Sabbath day, which he who sees all things has honored with holiness above other days." Then the thrice sinful man asked if there were a Lord in heaven who ordered the keeping of the Sabbath day. When they declared, "It is the living Lord himself, the ruler in heaven, who commanded the keeping of the seventh day," he responded, "I am a ruler on earth. I command you to take up your weapons and complete the king's business." Nevertheless, he was unsuccessful in carrying out his heinous plan. Judas Maccabeus mobilizes his men. In his utter vanity and arrogance, Nicanor decided to put up a public monument of victory over Judas and his army. But Maccabeus never ceased to trust the Lord and fully hoped that he would help him. So he encouraged his men to have no fear of any attack from the Gentiles, but to bear in mind how help had come to them from heaven in times past. Now they should anticipate the victory the Almighty would give them. He also exhorted them out of the law and the prophets, calling to mind the battles they had won, making them more eager to fight. Then after he revived their courage, he gave his commands, at the same time emphasized the Gentiles' faithlessness and their failure to keep their oaths. So he issued each of them an armor, not so much for the surety of shields and spears, as with the encouragement of courageous speech. Then he inspired them all by telling them about a dream, a kind of vision worthy of believing. The vision he saw was this: Onias, who had been high priest, a true gentleman of modest and noble manner, one well-spoken and from childhood formed in all that pertains to virtue, was praying with hands outstretched for the whole nation of the Jews. Then in the same manner another man appeared, distinguished by his gray hair and glory, and having about him a certain astonishing and majestic preeminence. Onias then spoke, saying, "This is Jeremiah, the prophet of God, a man who loves his brothers and prays fervently for the people and the holy city." Stretching forth his right hand, Jeremiah gave a sword of gold to Judas, and as he presented it to him, he addressed him as follows: "Take this sacred sword, a gift from God, by which you will strike down your enemies." Encouraged by Judas's words, the man, so good and able in stirring up virtue and courage in the souls of young men, they determined not to plan out a campaign. Instead, they would wage war bravely at once, deciding the matter with hand-to-hand combat with all manliness, because the city, the sanctuary, and the temple were at risk. Their main concern was not first for wives and children, or even for brothers and relatives. Their greatest fear was for the consecrated temple. As for those who remained in the city, they were distressed and worried about the conflict in the open country. Nicanor's demise. Everyone was now living in suspense over the outcome of the war. The enemy was nearby, their army was prepared for battle, and their elephants were strategically positioned, and the cavalry was deployed on the flanks. Maccabeus noted carefully the great masses before him, the variety of their ornaments, and the savageness of the elephants. So he reached out his hands towards heaven and called on the Lord, the wonder worker, for he knew it is not by weapons alone, but by the Lord's decision that victory is won by those worthy of it. Thus he cried out to him in the following manner: O Lord, in the time of Hezekiah the king of Judea, you sent your angel, and he killed as many as 185,000 in the camp of Sennacherib. So now, O ruler of the heavens, send us a noble angel to go before us, spreading fear and trembling. By the strength of your arms may those who speak blasphemy as they come against your holy ones be struck down. With these words he completed his prayer. Nicanor and his men marched ahead with trumpets and battle songs, but Judas and his men joined the enemy in battle with invocation and prayers. They fought with their hands and prayed to God in their heart, and struck down at least 35,000 men, so they were deeply gladdened by God's visitation. When the battle was ended and they were marching home with joy, they recognized Nicanor in full armor lying dead. With tumultuous shouts, they blessed the Lord in the language of their fathers. Then Judas, who was in body and soul ever the chief defender of his fellow citizens, and who from youth maintained goodwill towards his countrymen, commanded them to sever Nicanor's head and arm and take them back to Jerusalem. When he arrived there, he called his countrymen together and stationed the priests before the altar. Then he sent for those in the citadel. Before them he displayed the head of the defiled Nicanor and the slanderous man's hand, which he had boastfully stretched out against the holy house of the Almighty. He cut out the tongue of the godless Nicanor and announced he would feed it to the birds bit by bit and hang up the rewards of his folly opposite the sanctuary. Then everyone lifted their eyes to heaven and blessed the Lord, who visited them, saying, Blessed is he who kept his own place undefiled. Judas then fastened Nicanor's head to the wall of the citadel, a visible symbol to all present of the Lord's help. So they all decreed by public vote never to allow this day to be unobserved, but to celebrate it on the 13th day of the 12th month, called Adar, in the Syrian language, the day before Mordecai's day. The end. This is the way things turned out for Nicanor. So from that time on, the city has been controlled by the Hebrews. Thus I will end my story here. If I have written well and made my point in the narrative, this is what I myself desired. But if it was done poorly, it is just average. This is the best I could do. For as it is disagreeable to drink wine only or water only, whereas wine mingled with water is pleasing and delightful and brings greater joy, so also the writing style of the account delights the ears of those who read it. This then shall be the end. I will continue with Maccabees 3 in the next reading. And now we'll go to the New Testament. I have to get to my page. Okay. 2 John, which is a very short epistle, the second book of John, so just one chapter. Greetings and benediction, the elder, to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all those who have known the truth, because of the truth which abides in us and will be with us forever. Now, John calls himself the elder, or presbyter, which confirms that in the New Testament there is not always a distinction between the bishops and presbyters. He is confident I'm reading the notes for you now, he's confident that those who stand against the apostolic church are in the minority. He assumes the church is one true, concrete unity, and that it follows one rule of faith, whereas the unorthodox agree mainly in their rejection of this common faith. So, to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all those who have known the truth, because of the truth which abides in us and will be with us forever, grace, mercy, and peace will be with you from God the Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of the Father, in truth and love. Follow the law of love. I rejoice greatly that I have found some of your children walking in truth, as we receive commandment from the Father. And now I plead with you, lady, not as though I wrote a new commandment to you, but that which we have had from the beginning. That we love one another, this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment that, as you have heard from the beginning, you should walk by it. Now, he calls Christ the Son of the God, the Father, strongly refutes the deceivers and Gnostics. Jesus is the Son. The Son is by nature what his Father is, and he does what his Father does. Now, beware of deceivers and heretics, he says. For many deceivers have gone out into the world who do not confess Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is a deceiver and an antichrist. Look to yourselves that we do not lose these things which we worked for, but that we may receive a full reward. Whoever transgresses and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine of Christ has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into your house, nor greet him, for he who greets him shares in his evil deeds. John's plans and farewell. Having many things to write to you, I did not wish to do so with paper and ink, but I hope to come to you to speak face to face, that our joy may be full. The children of your elect sister greet you. Amen. Now here he says the children of your elect sister most likely refer to the church from which John is writing, namely Ephesus. And I guess from him here to be saying to the elect lady and her children, ecclesia. Ecclesia is feminine. You know, in English we don't have articles like the boy, the book, the girl. It's all one article, the. But in French, in German, in Greek, you have male, female, and neutral articles. Ecclesia is ecclesia, it's feminine. So the lady, the church, is basically ecclesia. Or if you want to say the soul, psyche, that's also feminine. So I just wanted to point that out to you here, because obviously John, writing in Greek, I think the only gospel that was written in Hebrew was Matthew, if I'm not mistaken. All the others were written in Greek. So ecclesia being the elect lady, the church, meaning here. And we'll continue with John 3 tomorrow. God bless you, and thank you for your support. If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.